The plea deal involving the president's son has fallen apart.
Now, he has now pleaded not guilty to 2 tax charges alone. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins us now. Jessica, what do you make of this deferral the judge is making when it comes to the weapons charge?
Well, I think it makes sense if she has more questions, which she clearly does. What she's saying is, I think, 2 things. One is, why is the weapons charge kind of wrapped up in the tax charges the way they are? And the other is, I think she's really asking questions about the form of the settlement, meaning that the settlement is essentially that Hunter Biden can be subject to a diversion program. So there will be no charges based on this. It's sometimes called kind of drug addict in possession of a gun charge if Hunter Biden can stay out of trouble, meaning can pass alcohol and drug tests and will not face any other criminal issues in those 2 years. There's some question by the judge about who would enforce that. And I think she believes that it should be the prosecution. The reporting indicates that, in fact, it would go to another judge as an initial matter. And I think she did what federal judges do, which is, I want additional briefing on this. At this point, again, to me, the most unusual thing is that, as Catherine Herridge discussed in the special report, there's this moment in the courtroom where everything appears to change, where the prosecution says, this is not a global settlement. This does not include every potential crime that Hunter Biden might have committed. And the defense says, then I'm ripping this up. I'm paraphrasing what Catherine said.
Right.
And that, to me, is the big story today, is that there had not, in fact, been a meeting of minds with respect to the prosecution and the defense and what they understood this plea deal to include. It's an entirely fair question from a federal judge to say, is this everything or is this limited?
So as I understand it, Jessica, both parties now have 14 days to brief, and the ruling might take weeks now. Though we thought it was all going to be settled today, it now is something that we're going to continue to assess for weeks to come. What are some of the risks and what are some of the advantages to both sides to actually being able to come up with a plea agreement?
So I think the plea agreement is useful to both sides just in general because it provides certainty and it saves resources. And for Hunter Biden, when it came to these particular charges here, when it came to the tax evasion charges and when it comes to the charges related to the gun possession, I think there was a lot of evidence, and maybe that's even an understatement, against him. And so to plead to misdemeanor and to save himself time in prison, that is a win. And for the prosecution to be able to save themselves the time and expense of a trial and the potential risk of a trial, there's always a risk there, that's also a win. I think the plea deal with respect to the tax charges and the drug charges really did make sense for both sides. As we've discussed throughout the morning, the bigger question is those potential charges related to foreign lobbying. And specifically, we're talking about whether or not Hunter Biden should have registered as a foreign lobbyist. Those are the more complicated charges. And that's where I think if the prosecution could come to a plea deal agreement, obviously big hypotheticals here, but that could save them the risks of trying to go to trial on those fairly complicated issues, which indicate to me there are also complicated facts because the investigation has been going on for half of a decade now.
Really fascinating. Jessica Levinson, thank you so much and for your insight. As always, CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins us now after being in the courtroom and spending days and weeks covering this story. Catherine, I just want to get your reaction from being in the courtroom and watching what really seems unprecedented and quite shocking to us all.
Well, the simple explanation, Errol, is that what we saw unfold in the courthouse behind me is that the two parties, the defense team and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware, were not on the same page as to whether this agreement would close the door on any further legal problems for Hunter Biden. And there was a moment about halfway through where the judge said, let's take a recess, because it was clear that there was a lot of daylight between the parties. And there was sort of a side conference between a member of the U.S. Attorney's Office and Chris Clark, who's one of the lead defense attorneys for Hunter Biden. It's a relatively small courtroom, so we could hear part of that conversation. And you could hear them going back and forth with Clark saying, well, this is all negotiated. I don't understand what you're sort of trying to get at here. And a member of the U.S. Attorney's team said there was no agreement, which I took to mean like no sort of global agreement here. And Chris Clark says, maybe we just rip this whole thing up. And to me, that was the moment that the entire thing started unraveling. They went back at least once more, talking privately to see if they could salvage this agreement. They have made some modifications to the language in the agreement, but now this all has to be reviewed again by the judge in about 30 days. The judge has deferred. She doesn't have enough information, she says, to accept or reject the plea. That being said, the federal judge made very clear during the 3-hour hearing that she has serious concerns about this plea agreement. Not only this diversion program for the gun charge, she says, I have people who come into my court who essentially get jail time for this charge, and these sorts of programs are unusual for a gun charge. But then also she had some concerns about the tax misdemeanor charges, and just bear with me while I explain that, because I think that's one of the big editorial developments today.
Yeah.
So the misdemeanor was to failure to pay 2017 and 2018. Each year it was about $1.5 million in income. Now, these were years where Hunter Biden's drug addiction was well documented. This was part of the argument why he failed to pay his taxes, even though he had the money available to him. The key thing here is the timing, and the judge drilled down on this a couple of times, I think with real purpose for the record and for the transcript. Hunter Biden filed those back tax documents in 2019. And the reason that matters is that in 2019, he told the court he was clean and sober. Yet in 2019, he continued to make misrepresentations about what were personal and business deductions. We know from speaking to the IRS case agent who led the evidence gathering in this case that there were deductions, he said were business deductions, for escorts, for a sex club, for no-show employees. So it seemed important to me. The judge wanted to be clear that he did this at a time where he now says that he was sober, right? So that kind of takes the addiction element out of consideration.
Those details really eye-opening.
Yeah. I actually turned to Errol at one point and said, did she just say what I think she said? Yeah, all right. It's also interesting, Catherine, since you brought up that point about the guns charge and the judge's questions about the diversion program, I've been researching it, and it's interesting that there's actually really good data about decreasing the recidivism rates, but that they are really applied, that they're rare, and that and that it just goes to the point that of this general question of, when you have individual judges, individual prosecutors, defense teams all making these agreements, that it isn't a universal blanket of justice that we apply, and that it very much depends on who's there and who is making the decisions. All right. Catherine Herridge, thank you.
We want to now bring in CBS News congressional correspondent Scott MacFarlane, gathering all the reaction on Capitol Hill. Scott, the obvious question would be, Republicans must be interpreting this as a bit of a political win for them.
They're saying in so many words, Errol, that this was a sweetheart deal that was proposed and that fell apart in the courtroom today, indicative of what they argue is a two-tiered system of justice. And they say if the judge face-to-face with Hunter Biden and face-to-face with the prosecutors today saw a red flag, there must have been a red flag in the deal that was cut between the U.S. Attorney of Delaware and Hunter Biden and Hunter Biden's defense team. This very much resonates with Republicans who've said this smelled fishy from the start. Now, we've seen plea agreements fall apart in court before. It's rare, but certainly not unheard of. It happens in federal courthouses and local courthouses on a daily or weekly basis. But often it's because the defendant and the judge are on a different page. The judge is reading through a statement of facts, a proffer or an agreed upon set of facts, and the defendant takes some issue with some of it. When that happens, the judge calls off the plea agreement and says, if you don't agree to these facts, you can't plead guilty today. This was quite different and a striking moment in the courthouse in Wilmington because the judge didn't like what either party came to the table with, didn't like the four corners of this agreement, and there also seemed to be a lack of communication in some way, shape, or form between the U.S. attorney and the defense, which is itself rare, if not problematic, when they've come to the courthouse on the day of the plea agreement. Let's look at the bigger picture, and the politics are ripe on this right now for Republicans and House and Democrats here in the U.S. House and Senate. This case is now back on a trajectory toward trial, and the trial, by the normal pacing of the federal court system, seems destined for 2024 if no new plea agreement is reached, which means at the end of this day, we could have a Biden and a Trump on a pathway towards trial in 2024.
It is a lot to take in, particularly today with so much happening, really on a minute-by-minute basis. Scott MacFarlane, as well as Catherine Herridge and Jessica Levinson, we thank you all.